The mountain had been silent for decades. So why did Caleb's dog freeze at the sealed cave and growl at something buried behind the rock? Stone cracked in the darkness as Milo clawed beside a rusted rail disappearing beneath the mountain. Caleb swept his flashlight across fresh drill marks. Then a deep metallic knock echoed from beyond the collapsed passage. Milo suddenly backed away. Something was behind that wall. What do you think Milo found? Milo was asleep beside the cot when his head snapped up. Not slowly. Not the lazy lift of a dog disturbed by thunder. 1 second, the German shepherd was stretched across the rough plank floor, muzzle resting between his paws. The next, he was upright, ears pointed toward the back wall of the cabin. Caleb Dawson opened his eyes. Rain hammered the metal patchwork over the roof. Wind pushed through gaps around the old window frames, making the curtains breathe in and out. Somewhere outside, water poured from a broken gutter in a steady rush. Caleb stayed still. Milo did too. Then the dog gave a low sound deep in his chest. What is it? Milo moved toward the rear door. Caleb checked the battered watch on the crate beside his cot. 11:47 p.m. He had been asleep for 23 minutes. That was better than most nights. A gust hit the cabin hard enough to shake the walls. The loose shutter outside slammed against the siding. Crack. Caleb was off the cot before he knew he'd moved. His shoulder struck the wall, his knees bent. One hand reached toward a weapon that wasn't there while his eyes swept the room. Door, window, corners, stove. For half a heartbeat, the cabin disappeared. Dust in white light, a radio screaming over somebody else's voice, a pressure wave hitting his chest. Then Milo touched his nose to Caleb's hand. The cabin returned. Rain. Wood smoke. Montana. Caleb slowly opened his fingers. Yeah, he whispered. I'm here. Milo turned back toward the door. Another growl. This one wasn't aimed at the storm. Caleb pulled on his boots and old canvas jacket. He took the heavy flashlight from the table, checked it with his thumb, then slipped a small first aid pouch into his coat pocket out of habit. Milo, stay. The shepherd stared at him. Caleb reached for the door latch. Milo shot past his leg the instant the door opened. Milo! The dog vanished into the rain. Damn it! Caleb stepped outside. Cold water struck his face immediately. The weak porch light illuminated only a few yards of mud and flattened grass before the mountain swallowed everything else. Beyond that circle, the forest was black. Milo! A bark answered from uphill. Not playful. Short, sharp. Then another. Caleb swung the flashlight toward the sound and moved. The beam bounced over lodgepole trunks, wet brush, granite, and runoff cutting brown channels through the soil. Caleb shortened his steps on the incline. The ground was saturated, and every patch of loose rock looked ready to move. Another bark. Caleb stopped. Listened. Wind from the west. Water behind him. Milo somewhere above and right. No engine. No human voice. Nothing moving through the brush that he could separate from the storm. He continued. Even after years out of uniform, his body still remembered how to cross uncertain ground. Don't stare at your feet. Look ahead. Pick the next safe point. Move. Stop, listen. His flashlight caught 2 amber eyes. Milo stood near the dark opening in the hillside behind Walter's cabin. The cave, at least that was what everyone called it. Milo. Come. The shepherd looked back at Caleb, then immediately returned his attention to the rock face. His tail was rigid. Caleb approached. The storm had changed the slope. A section of wet earth and broken granite had slid down across the cave entrance. Mud covered the lower rocks, and a young juniper had been torn out by the roots. Milo pushed his nose against the edge of the slide. Leave it. He began digging. Milo! The dog's front paws tore through mud. Caleb caught his collar. Milo pulled forward hard enough to surprise him. Hey, easy. The shepherd whined. Caleb knew that sound. Not fear. Frustration. Milo could smell or hear something he couldn't reach. Caleb crouched beside him and aimed the flashlight into the narrow black opening remaining above the slide. Nothing. He leaned closer. Cold air touched his face. That made him pause. The night outside was already cold, but this was different. A thin, steady draft pushed outward from somewhere inside the mountain. Caleb moved the light slowly across the stone. Natural fractures. Mud. Roots. Loose granite. Nothing unusual. Milo dug again. His claws scraped stone. Then came a different sound. Clink. Caleb froze. Milo struck it again. Clink. Metal. Back. Caleb pulled him away and used a broken branch to scrape mud from the spot. A dark line appeared beneath the soil. He cleared another inch, then another. Rust-red steel emerged under the flashlight. Caleb wiped it with his glove. It was narrow, straight, and far too regular to be natural. He followed it sideways through the mud until he found the edge. A rail. Caleb stared at it. He had seen old mining track before. Narrow-gauge rail used for ore carts, small enough to disappear beneath decades of dirt and rock. But according to the estate documents, there was no mine here. The county description had called this a natural geological feature. A cave. Nothing more. Milo strained toward it again. Hold up. Caleb moved the flashlight higher. Now that he knew what he was looking for, the mountain changed. A shallow groove in the rock wasn't erosion. It was a drill scar. Another appeared beside it. Then another. Two evenly spaced. His beam found a squared recess carved into the wall. Inside it was the blackened end of old timber, rotted almost flush with the stone. Caleb stood very slowly. Someone had worked here. Not recently, but deliberately. He stepped backward and studied the entire face of the slide. What had looked like a collapsed natural opening 20 seconds earlier now had a different shape. The rockfall concealed a passage wider than the visible cave mouth. Milo suddenly stopped pulling. His ears went forward. Caleb saw the change and immediately went still. What? The dog stared into the darkness. Caleb listened. Rain hissed through the trees. Water tapped against stone. His own breathing sounded too loud. Then it came. Knock. Deep, metallic, somewhere beyond the blockage. Caleb's grip tightened around the flashlight. It wasn't footsteps. It wasn't a voice. It sounded like weight shifting against something hollow, rock settling against old steel, perhaps, somewhere farther inside. Milo took one step forward. No. Knock. A little louder. Caleb saw movement above the dog. Milo, back! He grabbed the shepherd's collar and threw his weight downhill. The first rock hit where Milo's front paws had been. Another followed. Then half a dozen pieces of granite broke loose. Caleb dragged Milo behind the remains of an old retaining wall as the slope came down in a short, violent burst. Stone struck stone. Mud splashed his jacket. A chunk of granite bounced over the wall and disappeared into the darkness below. Then it stopped. Caleb remained crouched with one arm across Milo's chest. His flashlight had fallen several feet away but remained on, its beam cutting sideways through the rain. Neither moved. Caleb counted without intending to. 1, 2, 3, 5, 10. No second collapse. Milo's heart hammered beneath Caleb's forearm. So does mine, buddy. He ran both hands quickly over the dog, head, neck, ribs, legs, no blood, no obvious injury. Only then did Caleb retrieve the flashlight. They should go back. There was nothing useful they could do in darkness during a storm, and poking around unstable rock would be stupidity, not courage. Caleb turned toward the cabin. Then the beam passed across the newly exposed face. He stopped. The small collapse had removed enough mud to uncover part of the original opening. More rail was visible now. Beside it stood the remains of a timber support. And behind that, blackness. Not the irregular darkness of a crack in granite. A passage. Caleb stepped closer without crossing the fresh debris. The opening had straight edges in places. The roofline had been worked. On the left wall, he could make out more drill marks. Someone had driven a tunnel into this mountain. Then, at some point, the entrance had come down, or been brought down. Caleb thought of the probate papers stacked on Walter's old kitchen table. 41 acres, cabin, outbuildings, natural cave formation, no mine, no shafts, no workings, nothing about rails, nothing about timber supports, nothing that explained why Keller Ridge Resources had tried to buy the property before Caleb had even seen it. Milo stood beside him now, soaked and muddy. The shepherd looked into the opening and gave a quiet whine. Caleb lowered the flashlight. "We're done for tonight." This time Milo obeyed. They walked back toward the cabin together. Halfway down the slope, Caleb looked over his shoulder. The flashlight beam could no longer reach the opening. Only the mountain remained, black against a darker sky. For years, Caleb had learned to notice the detail that didn't fit. The vehicle parked where it shouldn't be. The silence where there should be noise. The fresh dirt beside an old road. An innocent-looking object that made the back of his neck tighten before his mind understood why. Tonight, the thing that didn't fit was an entire mountain. Walter Dawson had owned this land for decades. He had known every trail, every drainage, every stand of timber. There was no chance he had missed an old mine behind his own cabin. Which left Caleb with two questions he couldn't put down. Why had someone buried the entrance? And why had Walter made sure no one knew it was there? 3 weeks earlier, Caleb Dawson had been sleeping in a roadside motel outside Missoula when the ice machine dumped a fresh load into its metal bin. The crash came through the wall at 2:13 in the morning. Caleb's eyes opened before the sound finished. His feet hit the carpet. One hand swept toward the nightstand, while the other reached for something that had not been beside his bed in years. For one confused second, the green glow of the motel clock became instrument light. Headlights sliding across the curtains became movement beyond a compound wall. Then he heard Milo's nails click softly across the floor. The German shepherd stopped against Caleb's knee. Warm fur, steady breathing, room 17, Montana. Caleb looked at his empty hand. Just ice. Milo sat there anyway. Caleb scratched behind one of his ears and glanced at the bed. The sheets were twisted into a rope. There would be no more sleep. By 3, he was sitting outside with gas station coffee, while Milo watched 18-wheelers move along the highway. Caleb's old Ford pickup waited beneath a buzzing parking lot lamp, carrying nearly everything he used anymore. Tools behind the seat, 2 duffel bags, dog food, work boots, an army field jacket he never wore but never threw away. At 48, Caleb had become good at leaving. A month repairing irrigation pumps near Boise. 6 weeks servicing construction equipment outside Helena. A roofing job when somebody needed another pair of hands. He worked. He got paid. He moved. People called it freedom. Caleb had another word for it, though he rarely said it aloud. Temporary. At 7 that morning, his phone rang. Caleb Dawson? Speaking. My name is Eleanor Price. I'm an attorney in Helena. I'm calling regarding Walter Dawson. Caleb stopped with the coffee halfway to his mouth. Milo looked up. What about Walter? There was a short pause. I'm sorry to tell you your uncle passed away. Caleb stared across the parking lot. He hadn't spoken to Walter in nearly 9 years. The last Christmas card had arrived 3 years ago, addressed in Walter's crooked block letters. Caleb had carried it unopened in his glove compartment for 2 months, before finally reading it at a truck stop in Wyoming. 3 sentences. Hope you're keeping warm. There's always room here. Don't wait forever. Caleb had waited. How? Heart failure. A neighbor found him at home. It appears to have been peaceful. Caleb rubbed a thumb along the paper seam of his coffee cup. Okay. Eleanor hesitated, perhaps expecting something more. There is also the matter of his estate. Mr. Dawson named you as his sole beneficiary. That made Caleb look up. He did what? 2 days later, Caleb sat across from Eleanor Price in a small law office overlooking a wet Helena street. Milo lay beneath his chair. Eleanor was in her mid-50s, silver beginning to show through dark hair pulled neatly behind her head. She spoke plainly, which Caleb appreciated. She pushed a property map across the desk. 41 acres outside Silver Creek. Caleb studied the irregular boundary. Most of it appeared to be mountain. What's on it? A cabin, an equipment shed that's apparently in poor condition, some old utility structures, timber, rock. She adjusted her glasses. And a cave. Caleb looked up. A cave. That's how the county records it. A natural geological feature on the north side of the parcel. Useful. A corner of Eleanor's mouth moved. Mr. Dawson purchased the property decades ago. The taxes are current, but I don't want to mislead you. It isn't an easy asset. She handed him photographs. The cabin looked tired even under summer sun. One side of the porch sagged. Rusted roofing covered half the structure. The equipment shed behind it had partially collapsed. The access road looked worse. No grid power, Eleanor continued. The well hasn't been inspected recently. Winter access can be difficult. There are also questions about what it would cost to bring the cabin fully up to modern standards. Caleb set the photographs down. So Walter left me 41 acres of repair bills. That's one interpretation. It's the accurate one. Milo shifted beneath the chair. Eleanor opened another folder. There is an option that may simplify things. She placed a letter in front of him. The letterhead read, Keller Ridge Resources. They contacted the estate shortly after Walter's death. They own or lease several parcels in that area. They've offered $22,000 cash for the property as is. Caleb read the number again. 22,000 wasn't wealth, but it was a repaired transmission. A few months without chasing the next job. Maybe a deposit on a small rental where the landlord wouldn't add a pet fee large enough to make Milo seem like a luxury. Why? Eleanor folded her hands. Why what? Why do they want it? Land consolidation, according to their letter. Before probate is finished? They've approached Walter before. Caleb's eyes lifted. How many times? I don't know. Did he turn them down? Apparently. How much? I'd have to review the correspondence. Caleb leaned back. Milo's head appeared beside his knee. Eleanor studied him. You don't have to decide today. I already know what I should do. Sell? Caleb looked at the photographs again. The cabin meant nothing to him. At least that was what he told himself. Walter had been his father's older brother, the uncle who smelled of diesel fuel and cedar shavings and could rebuild a carburetor on a kitchen table without losing a screw. After Caleb's father died, Walter had called repeatedly. Caleb had answered less and less. It had been easier that way. Walter belonged to a part of his life Caleb had gotten good at keeping behind a locked door. "Where do I sign?" Eleanor reached for the documents. Then she stopped. "There's something else." She rose and retrieved a canvas field bag from a cabinet. This was specifically identified in Walter's instructions as personal property to be delivered to you. She placed it on the floor. Before Caleb touched it, Milo stood. The shepherd approached slowly and sniffed the canvas. His nose worked along one corner, then the leather strap. "What's in there? I haven't inventoried it beyond what the estate instructions required." Caleb opened the flap. The smell came first. Old canvas, machine oil, dust, something faintly metallic. He pulled out a scratched field compass, then a carbide mining lamp dulled almost black with age. Underneath lay a photograph. Two men stood beside a yellow excavator with mountains behind them. Walter was younger, broad-shouldered and grinning. Beside him stood Caleb's father. Caleb stopped breathing for a moment. His father looked about the age Caleb had been on his first deployment. On the back, someone had written, "Mercer Ridge Survey, October 1987. Wrong family name for the ridge, Caleb thought. Or perhaps an old local name. Beneath the photograph was a grease-stained notebook held shut with a cracked rubber band. Caleb opened it. Most pages were filled with numbers, bearings, measurements, hand-drawn lines, rock descriptions, dates stretching across years. He flipped farther. One page contained only a single sentence. The handwriting was Walter's. "If they still call the North Cave worthless, I did my job." Caleb read it twice, then a third time. Eleanor noticed the change in his face. "What does it say?" He turned the notebook toward her. She read the sentence. Neither spoke for several seconds. Caleb looked back at the offer. $22,000. A company that had approached Walter repeatedly. A property worth little on paper. A cave Walter apparently wanted people to believe was worthless. The old familiar sensation moved through Caleb. Not fear, exactly. An anomaly. A detail sitting where it shouldn't. During deployment, that feeling had made him slow a vehicle when a road looked too clean, or study a rooftop when everyone else was watching the street. Most times it meant nothing. Sometimes it mattered. Caleb reached for the sale documents. Eleanor slid a pen toward him. Instead of signing, he gathered the pages, squared their edges, and placed them back on her desk. "When do they need an answer?" "There's no deadline I would consider urgent." "Good." "Caleb, Walter's note may mean anything. Or nothing." "I know. That property is still going to need work." "I know that too." He returned the compass, lamp and photograph to the canvas bag, but kept the notebook in his hand. Milo was already standing beside him. Eleanor leaned back. "What are you going to do?" Caleb looked once more at the photograph of the broken cabin. For years, every difficult road had given him the same choice. Keep moving. This time, something waited at the end of one. He picked up Walter's old compass. "I'm going to look at it first." By sunrise the next morning, Helena was behind them. Caleb drove west and then north through country that seemed to grow larger as the towns grew smaller. Milo occupied the passenger seat, sitting upright whenever the road curved through open country, then lowering his head across his paws when there was nothing but highway. Walter's canvas bag rested behind Caleb's seat. The notebook rode beside him. He had read parts of it twice the night before and understood almost none of it. Bearings, distances, elevations, references to old cuts and drainages that didn't appear on his road map. Walter had drawn lines through the mountain as if he could see through stone. Caleb had learned long ago not to force meaning onto incomplete information. Observe first. Decide later. By noon, the highway narrowed to 2 lanes. Pine-covered slopes rose around them. Cell service disappeared. Caleb glanced at the dead bars on his phone, then automatically checked the fuel gauge. 3/4. He had water for himself and Milo, food for several days, blankets, tools, first aid supplies, a tow strap, tire chains, and enough fuel to get back to pavement if the weather held. The habit amused him sometimes. Other men went on road trips. Caleb planned extraction routes. The pavement ended 20 miles outside Silver Creek. Washboard gravel rattled the truck hard enough to make the tools behind the seat chatter. Caleb slowed. He began noticing things without consciously deciding to. A creek crossing deep enough to become trouble after heavy rain. A wide shoulder where he could turn the truck around. A washed-out culvert. A steep grade with no guardrail. A stand of dead timber leaning toward the road. Every few miles he glanced in the mirror. No vehicle behind them. Milo suddenly lifted his head. "What?" The shepherd looked toward a dark ridge to the north. Caleb followed his gaze. Granite pushed through the trees like the spine of some buried animal. "That's probably it." Milo's ears shifted. "Don't sound too excited." Silver Creek appeared around the next bend. Calling it a town was generous. A weathered sign announced the name beside an abandoned service station. Farther along stood a diner, a general store, a small post office, and perhaps 30 houses scattered along the valley floor. Old mining structures clung to the hillside above town. Most had surrendered to weather years ago. Caleb parked outside the diner. The moment he entered, a dropped metal tray hit the kitchen floor. Clang. His shoulders tightened. His eyes snapped toward the sound. Kitchen doorway. Waitress. No threat. 2 seconds. Maybe less. Still too long. Caleb chose the booth with the wall behind him. Milo settled beneath the table. The waitress brought coffee and looked down at the dog. He's better behaved than most customers. Usually. Passing through, Caleb poured cream into the coffee. Looking for the Dawson property. A fork stopped halfway to someone's mouth at the counter. Caleb noticed. The waitress did too. Before she could answer, an older man 3 stools down turned around. He had a heavy gray mustache and hands permanently darkened around the nails despite years of washing. "Dawson?" "Yeah." "Walter Dawson?" "My uncle." The man studied Caleb for several seconds. Then his gaze dropped to Milo. "You're Caleb." Caleb didn't ask how he knew. The man stood and walked over. "Ben Harlan." They shook hands. His grip was still strong. "I worked underground with your uncle before the last commercial outfit shut down." "Walter was a miner?" "Mechanic mostly. Could keep equipment alive that should have been scrapped 10 years earlier." Ben slid into the opposite side of the booth without waiting to be invited. "Heard Walter left you the ridge. News travels fast. In Silver Creek, news travels faster than people." Caleb almost smiled. Ben's expression changed when Caleb mentioned the cave. "North side? That's what the county calls it." Ben stared into his coffee. "Your uncle spent a lot of years up there." "Doing what?" "Studying." "Studying what?" "If I knew, I would have told you." Caleb watched him. Ben met his eyes. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Look at me like you're deciding whether I'm lying." Caleb took a drink. "Old habit." "Army?" "Yeah." "What did you do?" "Combat engineer." Ben nodded as though that explained more than Caleb wanted it to. "Your dad used to worry about you." Caleb's cup stopped. Ben seemed to realize he'd stepped onto thin ground. "Didn't mean to pry." My father thought joining was a mistake. No. The answer came too quickly. Caleb looked up. Ben leaned back. I knew your father, too. Not well. Walter brought him around sometimes. Your dad thought you were stubborn, thought you didn't know when to quit, but disappointed in you? Ben shook his head. He bragged about you until people got tired of hearing it. Caleb looked toward the window. A pickup rolled slowly past outside. For a moment, he saw his father at the kitchen table 25 years earlier, both palms flat against the wood. You don't have to prove anything by leaving. Caleb had heard only criticism. Maybe because he'd been 23. Maybe because anger was easier than asking what the man meant. You're sure? Ben's voice softened. I'm old, Caleb. Not confused. Under the table, Milo placed his muzzle on Caleb's boot. Caleb stared at the coffee until the surface stopped moving. Ben finally cleared his throat. You heading up today? That's the plan. I'll show you the turnoff. Easy to miss. The last 7 miles took nearly 40 minutes. Ben led in an old green pickup while Caleb followed through increasingly rough country. The road narrowed between lodgepole pine and granite outcrops, climbing until Silver Creek disappeared below them. They passed one locked gate, then another fork. Caleb memorized both. At a washed-out section, he got out and studied the ground before crossing. Ben watched from his truck. You expecting an ambush? Expecting a broken axle? Fair enough. The final bend revealed the property. Caleb stopped. For several seconds, neither he nor Milo moved. The photographs had been kind. The cabin sat beneath tall pines, gray and crooked, with sections of rusted metal roofing lifting at the edges. One corner of the porch had sunk nearly a foot. Behind it, the equipment shed had collapsed inward. A hand pump stood beside a concrete well cap, its handle frozen with rust. The land rose sharply beyond the cabin until forest met exposed granite. And there, near the base of the ridge, was the cave. Small, dark, unremarkable. Caleb stepped from the truck. The air smelled of pine sap, wet stone, and cold earth. Milo jumped down and began exploring. Caleb walked the cabin perimeter. Rot along the porch beam. Broken window. Chimney flashing gone. Evidence of water intrusion along the north wall. He opened the well housing and tried the pump. Nothing. 22,000 is starting to sound generous, he muttered. Ben stood with his hands in his jacket pockets. Walter lived rough. This isn't rough. It's surrender. Ben didn't answer. Caleb immediately regretted saying it. He looked toward the ridge. Milo had reached the cave. The dog sniffed around the entrance, moved away, then returned. Caleb called him. Milo glanced back but continued working the ground with his nose. He's interested, Ben said. He's interested in dead squirrels too. But Caleb watched. Milo moved 15 feet along the slope, stopped, returned to the entrance, then traced the same route again. The shepherd stood still, nose raised, testing the air. Caleb felt the old prickling sensation at the base of his neck. Something didn't fit. Ben started toward his truck. I'll leave you to it. Caleb turned. Ben. The older man stopped. At the diner, you said Walter spent years studying this ridge. He did. Was he looking for something? Ben looked past Caleb toward the dark opening in the mountain. For the first time since they'd met, the retired miner seemed uncertain about how much to say. Finally, he opened his truck door. Your uncle wasn't digging for gold, Caleb. He climbed behind the wheel. Caleb waited. Ben started the engine, then looked at him through the open window. Not at first. Before Caleb could ask what that meant, the old pickup rolled away. Dust hung between the trees long after Ben disappeared around the bend. Caleb stood beside his truck with Walter's notebook in one hand and watched the empty road. "Helpful man," he said. Milo trotted back from the hillside, nose muddy. "You're not much better." The shepherd sneezed and looked toward the cave again. Caleb ignored it. Before mysteries came shelter. He spent the rest of the afternoon making the cabin safe enough to sleep in. The porch could wait. The roof could not. He climbed carefully onto the lower section and found 3 places where old flashing had pulled loose and another where rain had worked beneath the metal sheets. He patched what he could with roofing cement and material from his truck. Inside, he removed the rotting mattress, swept mouse droppings from the floor, checked the stovepipe, and opened every cabinet before putting food inside. At dusk, he walked the perimeter with Milo. Dead pine leaning toward the cabin. Market. Creek 200 yards downhill. Good emergency water source if treated. Road vulnerable where the culvert crossed the drainage. Remember it if rain came. Caleb caught himself doing it again, turning a dead man's mountain property into an AO. Roots in, roots out. Resources. Hazards. He rubbed a hand across his face. This is Montana, not Kandahar. Milo looked at him. I know. You don't care. The first night was cold. Caleb slept on a folding cot near the wood stove with Milo beside him. At 1:36 a.m., the stove contracted as it cooled. Tick, tick, tick. Caleb opened his eyes. Tick. For a few seconds, the dark ceiling above him became another ceiling, corrugated metal vibrating beneath distant impacts. He could smell hot dust that wasn't there. His jaw locked. Then Milo shifted. One paw scraped softly over the floor. Caleb turned his head. Amber eyes reflected the fading stove light. He listened until the cabin became a cabin again. Go back to sleep. Milo lowered his head. Caleb remained awake until dawn. The next 3 days settled into hard, ordinary work. He cleared deadfall away from the chimney, rehung one shutter, reinforced the porch enough to keep it from dropping farther. The well pump refused every attempt to revive it, so he hauled water from the creek, filtered it, and boiled what he needed. Walter had left tools everywhere. Good tools, oiled tools. A man could neglect his roof and still respect a wrench, apparently. Caleb found spare belts labeled by size, coffee cans filled with bolts, salvaged bearings wrapped in oily cloth, and drawers organized with a precision that didn't match the chaos outside. That bothered him. The property looked abandoned. Walter's workbench did not. On the 4th morning, Caleb opened the grease-stained notebook again. He sat at Walter's kitchen table while Milo slept in a patch of sunlight. Pages of measurements stared back at him. North 18 west, 32 feet, basalt contact, airflow stronger after rain. Another page contained a rough sketch of the ridge with 3 lines disappearing beneath it. No legend. No explanation. Several pages had been removed cleanly near the binding. Caleb held the notebook sideways. Cut out. Not torn. Why? Milo opened one eye. Caleb continued. There were dates going back more than 20 years. References to places called Upper Cut, East Vent, Red Shelf, then repeatedly D-1, D-2, and once heavily underlined D-3. He searched the property records Eleanor had emailed him before he lost service. Nothing. No registered mine. No active claim listed in Walter's estate packet. No industrial structure beyond the ruined shed. No reason for Keller Ridge Resources to care. By afternoon, Caleb was standing at the cave again. In daylight, it was disappointing. The opening narrowed after only a short distance and ended at what appeared to be a wall of collapsed granite and soil. He didn't enter far. The rock overhead showed fractures, and Walter had left no support records Caleb trusted. Milo sniffed along the edge. There's nothing here. The dog moved farther right. Milo. He came back reluctantly. Caleb crouched and picked up a loose piece of stone. Ordinary granite. No sparkling treasure. No forgotten fortune. Just rock. He dropped it. The sound was small and final. That evening, Caleb drove into Silver Creek for fuel and supplies. He stopped at the diner. Ben wasn't there. The waitress poured coffee without asking. How's paradise? Needs a roof, a well, a floor, and possibly divine intervention. She laughed. You staying? Caleb looked through the window toward his truck. Milo sat behind the windshield watching the door. Don't know. Back at the property, Caleb found the Keller Ridge offer folded inside his paperwork. $22,000. He laid it on the table. For the first time, the number looked sensible. Not generous. Sensible. He could sell the land, fix the Ford, rent a small place somewhere outside town, and still have enough left to breathe for a few months. No mystery, no mountain, no dead uncle speaking in half-sentences from a notebook. Caleb looked around the cabin. A bucket caught water beneath one corner of the roof. Walter's chair sat empty by the stove. His father's photograph rested on the table. Caleb turned it face down. Tomorrow, he said. Milo lifted his head. We go back to Helena tomorrow. The dog stared at him. Don't start. Caleb folded Keller's offer and put it inside his jacket. Near sunset, the weather changed. Clouds rolled over the ridge with surprising speed, swallowing the last light. Wind bent the treetops. By 9, rain struck the cabin hard enough to drown out the radio. Caleb checked the roof patches, secured the loose shutter as best he could, and added wood to the stove. Milo slept beside the cot. At 11:47, his head snapped up. Caleb opened his eyes. The shutter slammed. Crack! His body moved before the room had a name. Then Milo touched him. Rain, cabin, Montana. And a moment later, the shepherd bolted through the door. Caleb followed him uphill. The rest happened quickly. The digging, the metallic clink, the rail, the cold draft, the deep knock beyond the obstruction, the sudden fall of rock. By morning, the storm had moved east. Clouds broke apart over the mountains, revealing strips of pale blue sky. Caleb stood outside the cave with a mug of coffee in one hand. Milo waited beside him. The night's small collapse had exposed more than Caleb first realized. He crouched without touching the unstable section. In daylight, the evidence was unmistakable. Parallel drill scars crossed one face of the granite. Squared pockets had been cut into both walls where support timbers once sat. A rusted narrow-gauge rail vanished beneath the debris. Caleb moved his flashlight across a narrow opening near the top of the blockage. A thread of cold air flowed steadily through it. Not trapped air. Circulation. There was open space beyond. Caleb looked back toward Walter's cabin. The old man had lived less than 200 yards from this spot. He had written about airflow, bearings, underground distances, D1, D2, D3. Walter had known. Of course he'd known. The question was why he'd hidden it. Milo stepped closer. Easy. The shepherd lowered his head toward the gap. His nostrils worked. Then his body changed. His tail stopped moving. The fur along his shoulders lifted. A low growl rolled from his chest. Caleb immediately set down the coffee. Milo? The dog pushed his muzzle toward the darkness. Another growl. Deeper this time. Caleb raised the flashlight and aimed it through the narrow opening. The beam reached only broken timber, damp stone, and darkness beyond. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. But Milo did not look away. And Caleb had learned long ago that when the dog noticed something he couldn't, the smart move was not to assume there was nothing there. He rested a hand against Milo's chest. Back. The shepherd resisted for a second, then yielded. Caleb did not enter the opening. Not yet. Old minds killed impatient people. He spent most of the morning studying the exposed section from outside. The storm had loosened part of the slide, but several large rocks still rested against one another at bad angles. He found rotten timber beneath them and a section where water had carved a narrow channel through the debris. Whatever was behind that wall had been there for decades. It could wait another day. Caleb returned to the cabin and gathered what he needed: helmet, gloves, headlamp, flashlight, rope, first aid kit, water, chalk, and Walter's notebook. He left the rope outside as a marker rather than trusting it as climbing protection. He wasn't going deep enough to need heroics. At the cave, he found another gap several yards from where Milo had been digging. The opening was narrow, but the material around it had settled against older rock instead of hanging loose overhead. Caleb crouched. Milo pushed beside him. No. The dog stared. You don't outrank me. Milo's ears moved forward. Caleb sighed. Close. He entered first. The temperature dropped almost immediately. His headlamp revealed damp stone and old timber darkened by age. The passage was tight for several feet, forcing him to turn sideways before it opened enough to stand. Caleb stopped there. He listened. Water. Somewhere deeper. A slow drip. No obvious movement. He swept the beam the way his eyes had once cleared unfamiliar rooms and alleys. Floor, left wall, ceiling, right wall, forward, repeat. He wasn't looking for an enemy now. He was looking for fractured rock, rotted support, holes, anything that could put him or Milo in trouble. Come. Milo slipped through. The shepherd immediately lowered his nose. The old rail continued beneath them. Caleb wiped dirt from one section with his boot. Two narrow tracks ran deeper into the mountain, partly buried beneath mud and fallen stone. Well, Walter, he whispered, what were you doing? Milo moved ahead. Easy. They went no more than 20 yards before Caleb stopped again. The passage widened into an old worked section. Wooden supports stood at uneven intervals. Some remained thick and solid-looking. Others had split down the center or bowed under pressure. A rusted hook hung from one post. On the wall, Caleb found the remains of a number painted in white, or perhaps part of a larger marking. He took out Walter's notebook. D-2 appeared on several pages. Caleb looked deeper into the tunnel. Not today. Milo sniffed toward the right wall. A faint current of air moved past Caleb's cheek. The dog followed it. There was a narrow side opening partly concealed behind broken boards. Milo's nose disappeared between them. Then came that same low growl. Caleb touched his collar. What have you got? Milo pulled. Caleb moved the flashlight through the gap. Dust, old timber, something metallic farther back. He shifted half a step. A sharp crack sounded behind him. The mountain vanished. For an instant, Caleb was somewhere else. White flash, pressure, a road outside Ghazni, a vehicle ahead disappearing behind brown dust, someone shouting, "Contact!" His body locked. Half a second, maybe less. Too long. Milo slammed into his left leg. Caleb stumbled sideways. A rotted timber broke loose where he'd been standing. Move! He grabbed Milo's harness and drove toward the wall. The overhead rock came down. Not the entire ceiling. A pocket. Enough. Stone crashed onto the old rail. The sound inside the confined tunnel was enormous. Caleb covered his head and turned his body over Milo as fragments struck his helmet and shoulders. Then silence. Dust filled the light. Caleb coughed. Milo. No response. His stomach tightened. Milo. The shepherd moved beneath his arm. Caleb pulled him clear. Good boy. Come on. They retreated immediately. No investigation. No second look. The tunnel had given its warning. Caleb kept one hand on Milo's harness as they moved toward daylight. Then he saw blood. A dark line ran down Milo's right shoulder. Caleb stopped. No. No, no. Milo tried to continue. Caleb knelt. A sharp fragment had opened a cut through the fur near the shoulder. It wasn't pouring blood, but it was more than a scratch. Then Milo lifted his front paw. Caleb checked it. One pad had torn on a piece of rock. That's enough. He got the dog outside. Sunlight felt almost too bright after the tunnel. Caleb sat Milo on a dry patch near the cabin and opened the first aid kit. His hands were steady until he parted the fur around the shoulder wound. Then he saw blood against dark hair. For one instant, another image tried to rise. A uniform, dust, a gloved hand he hadn't reached quickly enough. Caleb shut it down. Not there. Here. Milo. He irrigated the wound carefully. The shepherd flinched. I know. Caleb cleaned the torn paw next, checked for embedded stone, then wrapped it. Milo tried to stand. Absolutely not. The dog sat again. Caleb looked toward the mountain. The entrance seemed harmless in daylight. A black opening among gray stone. He hated it. Not because it had nearly hurt him, because Milo had been hurt getting him out. You saved me half a second in there. Milo panted softly. Half a second is a lot. Caleb carried what equipment he could in one trip and kept Milo close for the rest of the day. That evening, he made a bed for him beside the stove using 2 folded blankets. Milo's shoulder was cleaned and bandaged, his paw wrapped, and his food bowl placed within easy reach. Caleb sat on the floor beside him. Walter's notebook lay unopened on the table. For once, Caleb didn't care what was inside the mountain. At midnight, he checked the bandage. At 2, he checked it again. At 4, he woke without knowing whether he had actually slept. The cabin was quiet. Milo was awake. His head rested on the blankets, but his eyes were fixed toward the rear wall, toward the mountain. You've done enough. Milo's ears lifted. Caleb reached over and scratched gently beneath his jaw. We're not going back in there. The shepherd exhaled and closed his eyes. Near dawn, Caleb carried the bloody bandage and dirty gauze outside to seal them in a trash bag. He returned for Milo's collar, which he'd removed while cleaning the shoulder. Something caught the lantern light. Caleb stopped. Fine reddish dust clung to the leather and to several hairs trapped beneath the buckle. That wasn't unusual. The tunnel was full of mineral dust, but mixed through it were tiny bright flecks. Caleb carried the collar closer to the lantern. He rubbed one speck between his fingers. It flattened slightly, instead of crumbling. He stared at it. Then at the sleeping dog. Then toward Walter's notebook on the table. Caleb had worked around enough machinery, enough rock, and enough men who chased things underground to know better than to call a glittering fleck gold just because he wanted it to be. But he also knew something else. That reddish material had come from somewhere Milo had been trying very hard to reach. Caleb opened Walter's notebook. This time he began looking for every reference to red rock. He found the first one 14 pages in. Red shelf, east wall, air moving west. 3 pages later. Red seam continues beyond D-2. Do not open from this side. Then, written beside a rough sketch of the tunnel, survey recess, 6 feet past split timber. Caleb looked toward Milo. The shepherd was asleep beside the stove, his bandaged paw stretched carefully in front of him. The white wrap around his shoulder showed no fresh blood. "Not today," Caleb said. Milo opened one eye. "I mean it." For 2 days, Caleb stayed out of the mine. He changed Milo's dressings, kept the wounds clean, and limited him to short walks around the cabin. Milo hated every minute of it. The moment Caleb picked up his jacket, the dog would stand as if nothing were wrong. On the 3rd morning, Milo crossed the room without favoring the injured paw. Caleb crouched beside him and checked the shoulder. Healing. Still tender. "You're not leading." Milo licked his wrist. Caleb took that as agreement. He returned to the mine only after daylight had fully reached the slope. This time he moved even more carefully. He marked the unsafe section from the previous collapse and stayed clear of it. The old side opening Milo had found could be approached from a more stable angle along the wall. Caleb tested nothing he didn't have to and trusted no timber merely because it was still standing. Milo remained close behind. At the split support mentioned in Walter's notebook, Caleb stopped. 6 feet. He measured roughly along the wall. The rock looked ordinary. Then his flashlight caught a straight vertical edge. Caleb brushed away dust. A shallow recess had been cut into the stone and covered with boards stained nearly the same color as the surrounding wool. He removed the loose outer board. Behind it sat a gray metal case. Not ancient. Not treasure. A weatherproof survey box, perhaps 30 years old, with 2 corroded latches. Caleb carried it outside before opening it. He sat beneath the pines with Milo beside him. The first latch resisted. The second opened with a hard snap. Inside were 3 leather-bound journals wrapped in plastic, folded mine plats, envelopes from assay laboratories, old photographs, and a smaller envelope sealed inside a clear waterproof sleeve. One word was written across the front. Caleb. He stared at it for a long time. Then he opened it. Walter's handwriting was slower than the notes in the journal, the letters uneven but deliberate. Caleb. If you're reading this, you found the recess. I hope that means you were smart enough not to trust the first entrance. Caleb almost laughed. Little late on that advice. Milo rested his chin on Caleb's knee. He continued. There are things I should have told you while I was alive. I kept thinking there would be another Christmas, another summer, another chance for you to come through Silver Creek. That's an old man's excuse, not a good reason. Your father and I argued about plenty. We agreed about you. Caleb's fingers tightened on the paper. Wind moved softly through the lodgepoles. He read on. Your father was proud of you. I know you won't believe that easily, because the last conversation between you two went badly. He told me about it more times than I can count. He knew what he'd said, and knew what you heard were not the same thing. Caleb stopped. The mountain blurred at the edges. He remembered the kitchen, his duffel beside the door, his father standing at the table. You don't have to prove anything by leaving. Caleb had answered with words he still wished he could take back. At 23, he'd heard, "You're making a mistake." Now another possibility entered the room 25 years too late. Walter's letter continued. When you deployed, he followed whatever news he could find. Iraq first, then Afghanistan. If your unit was mentioned in a newspaper, he cut it out. If he heard there'd been trouble anywhere near where he thought you were, he wouldn't sleep. Caleb lowered the letter. His breathing had changed. Milo noticed. The shepherd pushed his muzzle beneath Caleb's hand. Caleb gripped the fur gently. I'm good. He wasn't sure who he was telling. He returned to the letter. After you stopped calling for those months overseas, your father drove me crazy. Every unfamiliar number made him jump for the phone. He was angry with you sometimes, but fear wears an ugly face on men like us. Caleb swallowed. The final years of his father's life had been reduced in Caleb's memory to silence. No reconciliation, no last long talk, just distance, followed by a phone call informing him that there would never be another chance. Walter had kept the missing part. Your father asked me for one thing before he died. Keep the ridge. Don't let it go cheap. If Caleb ever comes back with nowhere that feels like his, make sure there's still a place for him here. Caleb stopped reading. The forest became very quiet. A drop of water fell from Milo's bowl inside the open cabin. Somewhere on the ridge, a raven called once. Caleb stared at his father's photograph lying among the papers. Walter and his father beside the excavator. Two younger men. Two men who had known something Caleb had spent half his life misunderstanding. His father hadn't thought him a failure. Caleb pressed his thumb against the bridge of his nose. No tears came at first. Only one hard breath, then another. Milo shifted closer despite the injured shoulder and laid his head across Caleb's boot. Caleb left it there. For several minutes, he didn't read. He didn't search the maps. He didn't think about Keller Ridge or the glittering flakes on Milo's collar. He sat beneath the trees with one hand resting between the dog's ears. Eventually, Caleb picked up the letter again. Walter's tone changed on the second page. Now we get to the part where you need to be careful. The ridge has a history the county records don't tell correctly. Some of that is neglect. Some of it is because old mining records were transferred badly. Some of it was intentional. I've spent years tracing the original workings. Do not assume anything shiny is valuable. Do not trust old assay numbers until somebody independent verifies them. And don't let anybody talk you into opening ground that isn't stable. Caleb glanced at Milo's bandage. Apparently, he knew me. Then he reached the final paragraph. If Keller comes for the mountain, he already knows about Dawson number 3. Caleb read the sentence twice. The warmth left the moment. He unfolded the mine plats. Dawson number 1 appeared on a hand-drawn 19th century survey near the eastern drainage. Number 2 lay beneath the northern ridge. He searched the entire sheet. No number 3. He opened another map. Nothing. Then another. Still nothing. Caleb returned to Walter's journals. D3 appeared repeatedly, but never with a complete location. One entry read, D3 remains outside modern survey. Another. Keller men asking about old boundary. And finally, never put full route on one map. Caleb sat back. Walter hadn't merely hidden a box. He had divided information deliberately. Someone had been looking for whatever Dawson number 3 was while Walter was still alive. Caleb looked toward the mine entrance, then toward the road. The Keller offer suddenly felt different. $22,000 hadn't been a convenient purchase of worthless land. It had been a question. Did the heir know what he had? Caleb gathered the papers and placed them back into the box. Milo stood carefully. Easy. The shepherd looked uphill. Caleb followed his gaze. Nothing moved among the trees. Still, he listened. Wind, birds, creek. No engine, no footsteps. He carried the box into the cabin and locked the door behind them. Then he spread every modern property map Eleanor had given him across Walter's kitchen table. He searched until sunset. Dawson number 1 did not exist. Dawson. Number 2 did not exist. And there was certainly no Dawson number 3. By dark, Caleb understood only one thing with certainty. Walter had spent years making sure the wrong people couldn't find it. And according to his final warning, Grant Keller was already looking. 2 mornings later, Caleb heard tires on gravel. He was beneath the cabin's porch replacing a rotten brace when Milo lifted his head. The shepherd was healing well, but the white wrap still covered his right paw. He rose carefully and faced the road. Caleb stopped hammering. The engine was wrong for Ben's truck. Too quiet, too smooth. He slid out from beneath the porch and stood. A black SUV appeared between the pines. Clean bodywork, Montana plates, no company markings. Caleb watched it come up the final grade. The driver didn't hesitate at the fork, didn't slow to check the weathered Dawson mailbox, didn't look for the cabin. Whoever was driving had been here before, or knew exactly where he was going. Caleb wiped his hands on his jeans. Stay close. Milo moved beside him. The SUV stopped 30 feet from the porch. A man stepped out. Early 50s, gray jacket, expensive boots that looked almost new. His hair was silver at the temples, and he carried himself with the relaxed confidence of someone accustomed to entering rooms where people already knew his name. Mr. Dawson? Depends. The man smiled. Grant Keller. Caleb said nothing. Keller Ridge Resources. I figured. That changed the smile slightly. Keller closed the door and looked around. Not casually. Caleb watched his eyes. Cabin, equipment shed, tree line, ridge, then the cave. Only for a second, but he looked directly at it. Quite a place, Keller said. That's one word. Your uncle was attached to it. You knew Walter? Professionally. We spoke several times over the years about buying this, among other things. Keller walked toward the porch. Milo stepped forward. Not aggressive, just present. Keller stopped. Beautiful shepherd. Milo. Friendly? When he has a reason. Keller's smile returned. I'll respect his judgment. Caleb noticed Keller had positioned himself where he could see both Caleb and the mountain. Why are you here? Straight to business. Saves daylight. Keller nodded. Fair enough. I heard you haven't accepted our offer. I haven't. $22,000 was based on the estate's condition before anyone knew what repairs you might undertake. I've been authorized to improve it. Caleb waited. $85,000. The number landed harder than he expected. Milo glanced up as if he had heard the change in Caleb's breathing. $85,000. No leaking roof, no dead well. No wondering whether the truck would start after the first hard freeze. No old mine threatening to come down around him. Caleb kept his face still. For 41 acres you say aren't worth much. We don't say they're worthless. County nearly does. Counties value property for one purpose. Businesses value it for another. What purpose? Access. Keller gestured toward the ridge. We control mineral leases on parcels north and west of here. Your uncle's property sits between two areas that may become useful to us someday. A service corridor through this parcel could shorten future access considerably. Reasonable. Clean. Almost too clean. Caleb had heard explanations like that before in different places and different circumstances. The best cover story was usually the one containing enough truth to survive the first question. Where would the corridor go? Keller looked uphill, probably along the old drainage, then across the south-facing shoulder. That side stays clear longer before winter really settles in. Caleb's eyes narrowed. Walter's modern property map didn't name that drainage. The county map didn't either. Ben had called it Miller Wash once while giving directions. Keller had not used a name, but he knew the terrain. You've walked it? Our survey teams have studied the area. On my land? On surrounding land? Caleb said nothing. Keller slipped his hands into his jacket pockets. Mr. Dawson, I'm not here to pressure you. Frankly, I think 85,000 is a very good outcome. Your uncle loved this place, but sentiment doesn't repair roofs. His gaze moved to the cabin. Or roads. Milo left Caleb's side. Milo. The shepherd walked toward the SUV. Keller stayed still. Milo sniffed the rear tire. Then the front. His nose remained close to the tread. Caleb watched. The dog moved to the passenger side wheel and sniffed again. Something held his attention. Milo, here. He didn't come immediately. Caleb walked over. The tire was clean along the sidewall, but packed deep inside the tread was dried mud. Most of it was ordinary brown road dirt. Mixed through it was another color, reddish-gray. Fine. Almost powdery. Caleb crouched. He had seen the same material on Milo's collar. Inside Walter's tunnel. Keller's voice came from behind him. Problem? Caleb stood. No. Milo finally returned to his side. Keller studied him. You've been exploring. It wasn't phrased as a question. Caleb looked at him. What makes you say that? The condition of your clothes. Your uncle spent half his life crawling around that ridge. I assumed you inherited some curiosity. Caleb had changed clothes that morning. No mine dust remained on them. Keller realized the mistake almost as soon as Caleb did. A tiny one. But there it was. There's a cave behind the cabin, Keller continued smoothly. Hard not to notice. Caleb let the silence stretch. Keller looked toward it again. Natural formations around here can be unstable. That's thoughtful. I'd hate to see you hurt yourself over Walter's old stories. Caleb felt something cold settle into place. What stories? For the first time, Keller paused. Every old mining town has them. Gold? Usually. Lost mines? Those too. Dawson. Number 3? The change was almost invisible. Keller's jaw tightened. His eyes stopped moving. Then the polished expression returned. I don't know that name. Caleb believed many things about Grant Keller in that moment. That wasn't one of them. Keller reached inside his jacket and produced a business card. 85,000. Cash purchase. We handle closing costs. Caleb took the card. Not interested. You should think about it. I just did. Keller's voice remained calm. Your uncle spent decades pouring money into this mountain. Look where it left him. Caleb glanced at Walter's cabin, then at Milo's bandaged shoulder. Still not for sale. Keller nodded slowly. No anger, no raised voice. He walked back toward the SUV, then stopped beside the driver's door. Mountains are expensive things to love, Mr. Dawson. Caleb met his eyes. So I've heard. Keller climbed in. The SUV turned around and disappeared down the road. Caleb waited until he could no longer hear the engine. Then he looked at Milo. The shepherd was staring uphill. Show me. Milo moved toward the cave but passed it. He climbed along the slope through wet brush, favoring the wrapped paw just enough that Caleb shortened his pace. 30 yards above the main opening, Milo stopped near a depression hidden between granite shelves. Cold air moved faintly through the brush. An old ventilation opening. Caleb had seen it marked only as a question mark in Walter's notebook. Milo sniffed the ground. Caleb crouched. Boot prints. 2 different tread patterns. One older, softened by rain. The other sharp. Fresh mud pushed outward at the heel. Caleb touched the edge without disturbing it. Recent. Very recent. He looked downhill toward the empty road, then toward the trees surrounding Walter's property. Someone had been up here while Caleb was working below. Maybe yesterday. Maybe last night. He studied the clean edges of the print again. Less than a day old. Caleb did not follow it. That was the first instinct he distrusted. The second was to walk downhill, get in his truck, and find Grant Keller. He ignored that one too. Instead, Caleb photographed the prints, the ventilation opening, and the surrounding ground without stepping through it. He marked the location on Walter's map, then walked Milo back to the cabin. Information first. Action second. That lesson had kept men alive in places where impatience could turn a bad situation into a permanent one. By noon, Caleb was in Silver Creek. He found Ben Harlan behind his house splitting kindling beneath an aluminum awning. Ben looked at the photographs on Caleb's phone. His expression hardened. That's above Walter's north workings. You knew about them? Knew there were old workings. Half this country has holes in it. Caleb opened Walter's notebook to the references he'd marked. Dawson, number 3. Ben stopped moving. You've seen that before. Ben set down the hatchet. Come inside. His kitchen smelled of coffee and wood smoke. Caleb spread Walter's maps across the table while Milo settled near the door. Ben put on reading glasses. Dawson, 1 and 2 were old prospects, he said. Late 1800s, maybe a little later. Different names depending on which record you trust. Dawson wasn't the original company name. Locals started calling them that after your family ended up with the Ridge. And 3? Ben traced a finger along an old line. Story was there'd been another working farther west. Men followed a mineralized zone into the Ridge, then had a bad collapse. After that, ownership changed. Records got sloppy. Boundaries moved on paper. Was there gold? Ben looked up. There's gold all over these mountains. That's not what I asked. No. You asked whether there was enough to matter. He tapped the map. I don't know, Wes. Caleb showed him the reddish dust from Milo's collar, sealed in a small plastic bag. Ben held it toward the window. Could mean something. Could mean nothing. So we verify. Now you're talking sense. Ben gave him the name of a geologist in Bozeman. Dr. Hannah Brooks arrived 2 days later in a mud-splashed pickup that immediately made Caleb trust her more than Keller's spotless SUV. She was 41, compact, practical, and unimpressed by mysteries. Before she looked at a single rock, she looked at the tunnel. No one opens anything, she said. Caleb nodded. No digging through unsupported collapse. No crawling through gaps because a 100-year-old notebook says there's something interesting on the other side. Ben raised both hands. I've survived 67 years by avoiding exactly that. Hannah looked at Caleb. And the dog? Milo goes where I say. Milo looked up at him. Hannah almost smiled. Good. Because old minds don't care how smart he is. They began with Walter's records. Hannah compared his bearings to historical survey plats and topographic features. Several of Walter's measurements were surprisingly precise. Others seemed deliberately incomplete. He's separating the route, she said. Caleb leaned over the table. Meaning, no single page tells you how to reach D3. Look. She aligned 3 sketches. A ventilation bearing from one page matched a rock contact on another. A third referenced elevation rather than distance. Walter hadn't drawn a treasure map. He'd built a puzzle. By late afternoon, they had a probable location. Not behind the main collapse, farther along an accessible branch of the old workings. The next morning they entered together. Hannah carried instruments and sample bags. Ben moved with the slow caution of a man who had spent years underground and respected every creak. Caleb stayed between them and Milo. The tunnel narrowed. Water shone on black rock. Old rails appeared and vanished beneath debris. Hannah stopped repeatedly to examine exposed surfaces. Quartz. A few yards later, pyrite. Ben glanced at Caleb. Fool's gold. Don't buy the Cadillac yet. I wasn't planning to. They reached a timbered side passage. Milo stopped. Caleb nearly walked into him. Move. The shepherd didn't, his ears angled forward. Then he stepped backward. Caleb saw it immediately. Not stubbornness. Warning. Milo? The dog backed into his leg. A pebble fell from above. Tick. Hannah looked up. Another grain of rock dropped. Then another. Out, Caleb said. Nobody argued. Back the way we came. Keep spacing. Ben moved first. Hannah followed. Caleb turned with Milo. Behind them came a soft cracking sound. Caleb's body wanted to run. He didn't. Fast movement on wet rock could be worse. Easy. Keep moving. They cleared the timbered section. Seconds later, a support gave way behind them. The collapse hit with a rolling crash that pushed dust through the passage. Milo pressed against Caleb's leg. Caleb kept one hand on his harness until the sound stopped. Hannah coughed into her sleeve. Your dog just earned his consulting fee. Ben looked at Milo. I'll buy the steaks. They did not return to that passage. Instead, Hannah collected samples from stable exposures Walter had already documented along the accessible wall. At one point, she scraped away weathered material and exposed a narrow band running through quartz. She said nothing. That silence made Caleb more curious than excitement would have. What? Sample first. That good? Sample first. They left before dark. Hannah sealed and labeled everything at Walter's kitchen table. Chain of custody, locations, dates, no guesses, no promises. When she drove away with the samples, Caleb watched until her taillights disappeared. The waiting was worse than the tunnel. 5 days. Caleb repaired the cabin. Milo's paw bandage finally came off. Ben visited twice and refused to speculate. Keller did not return. That bothered Caleb more than if he had. On the 6th afternoon, Hannah's pickup climbed the road. Caleb saw her face through the windshield. She carried a folder. They sat at Walter's table. Milo lay beneath it. Ben stood near the stove. Hannah opened the report. The samples contain gold. Nobody moved. Caleb looked at her. How much? Enough that I'm not comfortable dismissing Walter's work. Ben slowly lowered himself into a chair. Hannah continued. Several samples show meaningful mineralization. One is particularly interesting. If the structure continues at depth and across the distances Walter believed, this could be significant. Caleb stared at the paper. Gold. The word felt ridiculous inside Walter's leaking cabin. He looked toward Milo. The shepherd was watching him. A laugh escaped Caleb. One short sound. He hadn't meant to make it. Ben smiled. Your uncle would have enjoyed that. Caleb picked up the assay sheet. So Keller knew. He may have suspected, Hannah said. Don't jump farther than the evidence. He's offering $85,000 for rock the county barely values. That tells you he's interested. It doesn't tell you exactly what he knows. Caleb looked around the cabin. The patched roof, Walter's compass, his father's photograph. For the first time, the place no longer looked like a burden someone had left behind. It looked like something Walter had defended. Something Caleb's father had asked him to keep. Something buried beneath the mountain had finally answered one question. Caleb looked at Hannah. If the vein is what Walter thought, what are we talking about? Potentially a lot of money. Ben gave a low whistle. Hannah raised a hand. Potentially. She emphasized the word. Ore in the ground isn't cash. You need more exploration, engineering, permits, environmental review, capital, legal certainty. But it's real. The mineralization is real. Caleb leaned back. For the first time in years, possibilities appeared faster than he could push them away. He could repair the cabin properly, fix the truck, stop moving from job to job. Maybe the mountain really had been waiting for him. Hannah closed the assay report. Then she reached into her folder and removed another document. Her expression had changed. Caleb noticed immediately. What is that? Something I found while checking Walter's historical records against current property maps. She placed it on the table. Ben leaned closer. Hannah pointed to a faded line crossing the old survey. The gold isn't your biggest problem. Caleb's brief smile disappeared. Hannah traced the line toward the modern boundary. If this record is still legally controlling, the only practical commercial access to these workings doesn't belong to you. Outside, wind moved through the pines. Caleb looked down at the line. It crossed the ridge, then continued directly onto land marked with one name: Keller Ridge Resources. Caleb stared at the map until the lines began to blur together. Explain it. Hannah turned the document so everyone could see. The old wagon route came up from the valley here, crossed what used to be a separate claim, then reached the Dawson workings from the west. That neighboring parcel changed hands several times. Her finger stopped at the modern boundary. Keller owns it now. Caleb looked toward Ben. Can we use the road? Ben shook his head slowly. Not with equipment unless you've got legal access. I own the mine. You own your property and whatever mineral rights Eleanor confirms go with it, Hannah said. That's not the same as having permission to haul drilling equipment across somebody else's land. Caleb stood and walked to the window. Outside, late afternoon sunlight touched the ridge. A few hours ago, he'd looked at that mountain and seen possibility. Now the gold might as well have been on the moon. What about the road I drove in on? Too narrow in several sections, Ben said. Wrong grade for serious mine traffic. You'd spend a fortune rebuilding it, assuming the county and environmental permits allowed it. Caleb gave a humorless laugh. So Walter left me gold I can't reach. Hannah closed the folder. Don't make that conclusion yet. But the problem grew worse over the next week. Eleanor drove up from Helena, carrying boxes of title records, old deeds, easements, and photocopied county plats. She spread them across Walter's kitchen table until there was barely room for coffee. The mineral rights attached to your 41 acres appear intact, she said. That's the good news. And the bad? The historic access situation is a mess. She showed Caleb an easement recorded decades earlier for limited agricultural and residential passage. It did not clearly permit commercial mineral traffic. The old mine road crossed Keller's parcel. Without an agreement, a court ruling, or another viable route, Caleb had no simple way to move heavy equipment where it would eventually need to go. Then Eleanor pulled out another document. Keller Ridge filed this yesterday. Caleb read the first page. Competing claim? They're asserting that some historical workings associated with Dawson No. 3 may originate beneath rights connected to one of their older parcels. Is that true? I don't know yet. Do they? Maybe they have evidence. Maybe they're creating leverage. Caleb's jaw tightened. Eleanor watched him carefully. Don't call Keller angry. I wasn't going to. Good. He had been. That afternoon, the offer arrived. Not $85,000. $275,000. Enough to pay every debt Caleb had. Enough to replace the Ford. Enough for a modest home somewhere easier. Enough to walk away from the mine, Keller, the legal records, the leaking cabin, and every question Walter had buried beneath the ridge. Caleb left the papers untouched until after dark. Then he sat at the table staring at the signature line. Milo lay beside the stove. His shoulder had healed enough that the fur was beginning to hide the injury, though Caleb still noticed a slight hesitation when the dog rose too quickly. 275, Caleb said. Milo's ear moved. You know how many transmissions that buys? No response. You're terrible with money. Caleb leaned back. He thought about Walter's letter. His father asking Walter to keep the ridge. But his father was gone. Walter was gone. Neither man had to repair the road. Neither had to pay lawyers. Neither had to spend another winter waking in a tabasin every time the stove cracked. Maybe keeping the land wasn't courage. Maybe it was just stubbornness wearing a better uniform. A low engine sound reached the cabin. Milo's head rose. Caleb immediately killed the lamp. Darkness filled the room. The engine stopped somewhere below the property. Caleb didn't move toward the door. He stood beside the window where he could look through a narrow gap without silhouetting himself. Milo started forward. Stay. The shepherd froze. Caleb listened. Nothing. Then a faint white beam moved between the trees below. Once. Gone. Again. Too low to be headlights. A handheld light. Caleb's breathing slowed. He checked his phone. 1 bar. Enough. He called the county sheriff's office and kept his voice quiet. This is Caleb Dawson, north of Silver Creek. I have an unknown vehicle stopped near posted private property. Possible trespass. I'm not approaching. The dispatcher took the location. Caleb remained inside. Years ago, another version of him might have gone looking. That version had learned the cost of chasing uncertainty into darkness. Milo stood beside him, silent now. The engine started again. Caleb checked his watch. 10:18. The vehicle moved uphill briefly, then turned. A minute later, Caleb caught 2 red taillights through the trees. 10:21. Direction south. He wrote both times on Walter's notepad. The sheriff's deputy arrived 35 minutes later. By then, the vehicle was gone. The deputy walked the lower boundary, with Caleb using flashlights. They found tire impressions near the road, but nothing distinctive enough to identify a vehicle. You expecting trouble? The deputy asked. Not until recently. With who? Keller Ridge. The deputy looked toward the mountain. I'll make a note. If you see them again, call. Don't go playing sheriff yourself. Wasn't planning to. The deputy glanced at Caleb. Good. At daylight, Caleb and Milo walked the property. Milo found the first survey ribbon, bright orange plastic tied around a young pine near the western boundary. Caleb stopped. Another appeared 40 yards uphill. Then another. Someone had been marking a line. He photographed each one before touching anything. The route climbed toward the old ventilation opening, then curved away from the mine. Caleb returned to the cabin and retrieved Walter's maps. He laid one across the hood of his truck. The orange markers roughly followed a faint pencil line. Caleb had seen it before but ignored it because Walter had drawn a thick red stroke across the route from one side of the page to the other. No written explanation. Just a rejection. Caleb looked uphill. Milo sniffed one of the ribbons, then moved beyond it. Easy. The shepherd continued. The marked route entered thicker timber behind the cabin, where fallen trees and brush hid the ground. Caleb followed only far enough to establish direction. Walter's red line crossed the slope there. Why mark a route only to cross it out? Why would Keller's people care about it? Caleb crouched near an old stone half buried beneath moss. Its exposed edge was unusually straight. Cut stone. Not natural. Milo sniffed beyond it. Caleb called him back. Not today. He had learned that lesson. He returned to the cabin as clouds gathered over the ridge. The purchase agreement still waited on Walter's table. $275,000. Caleb looked at the signature line, then at Walter's crossed-out route. Keller wanted the mine. Walter had hidden the mine. Now someone was secretly surveying a path Walter had specifically marked in red. For the first time, Caleb wondered if the route wasn't something Walter had rejected. Maybe it was something he'd been trying to protect. The next morning, the mountain disappeared behind low clouds. Caleb stood on the porch drinking coffee while Milo tested the air. The German shepherd's shoulder had healed well, and the torn paw pad had closed, but Caleb still watched him more closely than before. The orange survey ribbon was visible through the trees. Caleb looked at Walter's map again. The red line began behind the cabin, crossed a steep shoulder, then vanished beneath a heavy mark Walter had drawn over it. No explanation. Just red. Caleb folded the map. We look. We don't chase. Milo's tail moved once. Caleb packed lightly. Water, first aid kit, compass, map, flashlight, extra gloves, emergency blanket, and a short length of utility cord. He clipped Milo's working harness around the dog's chest. They left before 8. The route was easy at first. Old lodgepole pines stood wide apart, their trunks black with moisture. The ground smelled of wet needles and granite. Caleb found another orange ribbon, then another. Whoever had surveyed the line had been methodical. After half a mile, the terrain changed. The slope dropped sharply toward a drainage hidden beneath timber. Caleb stopped. That's why Walter crossed it out. Loose scree covered the hillside beneath a thin layer of early snow. He checked the sky. The clouds had lowered. He could continue another few hundred yards and still turn around safely. That was all. Milo moved ahead, nose close to the ground. Close. The shepherd slowed. Caleb studied the terrain rather than the ribbons now. A faint depression ran across the slope. Too straight. Maybe an old trail. Maybe erosion. He took another step. Something cracked behind him, sharp, sudden. A dead limb snapping under snow. Caleb dropped before he knew why. His right hand went toward his hip. His eyes searched for cover. For half a second, there were no Montana pines. There was a dusty road in Afghanistan. Heat. A burst of sound. A man shouting over the radio. Then Caleb's boot slid. The present returned all at once. Whoa! The scree broke beneath him. He went downhill. His shoulder hit first, then his hip. He clawed at loose rock, but everything he touched moved with him. Milo, stay! The command came too late. Milo lunged after him. Caleb saw the ravine below, not a cliff, but steep enough that a bad fall could break a leg or worse. He twisted onto his stomach and dug his boots into the slope. Nothing held. Then his body jerked violently. The strap of his pack cut into his shoulder. He stopped. For one stunned second, Caleb didn't understand why. Then he heard Milo cry out, "Milo!" The shepherd's harness had snagged around a thick mountain mahogany branch above him. Milo was braced sideways against the slope, claws digging into mud and stone. The tether Caleb had clipped between the harness and his own pack for the steep section was stretched tight. The dog had stopped him, but the force had dragged Milo against an exposed slab of granite. Blood marked the rock. Caleb's chest went cold. Don't move. He reached upward. Too far. The ground beneath his left knee shifted. Caleb forced himself to stop. Think. Not fast. Correct. He found a solid root with his right hand, tested it, held. He wrapped his belt around the root and through his pack strap, creating enough support to take tension off Milo's harness. Only then did he climb. One movement. Set. Test. Move. Milo remained almost perfectly still. Good boy. Caleb reached him. The shepherd's breathing was fast. A deep cut ran along his left flank. Blood had soaked the fur beneath the harness. Caleb's hands stopped. For an instant, it wasn't Milo. Brown dust hung in the air. Someone was lying beside a damaged vehicle. Caleb remembered running. Remembered being held back because the ground hadn't been cleared. Remembered a voice saying they couldn't reach him yet. Remembered watching seconds become minutes. The memory hit with the force of a door kicked open. Milo whimpered. Caleb blinked. Montana. Snow. Dog. Now. I'm here. He pressed gauze against Milo's wound. This time I'm here. The bleeding slowed under pressure. Caleb checked the shoulder next. Milo flinched when he touched it. The old injury had been aggravated. All right. Caleb looked downhill. The truck was miles away. The cabin was closer. He could not carry a 70-pound shepherd over that terrain the entire distance, so they moved in stages. Caleb supported Milo with the harness on level ground and carried him across the worst sections. When his arms failed, he stopped, rested, checked the wound, moved again. Snow began falling harder. Milo tried twice to walk without help. No hero stuff, Caleb told him. The words caught in his throat. By the time the cabin appeared through the trees, Caleb's legs were shaking. He got Milo inside, wrapped him in a blanket, then drove for the nearest veterinary clinic. The trip took more than an hour. Caleb kept one hand near Milo whenever the road allowed. Stay with me, buddy. Milo's eyes remained open. At the clinic, a veterinarian named Dr. Susan Reed examined him. The flank wound looks worse than it is, she said after cleaning it. No penetration into the body cavity. That's the good news. Caleb exhaled for what felt like the first time in an hour. And the shoulder? Strain around the previous injury. I don't feel a fracture. She placed several stitches along Milo's flank. He needs rest, real rest this time. Caleb nodded. I can do that. Milo came home wearing a protective wrap, moving slowly, and carrying the tired expression of a dog who had finally decided humans might be allowed to handle things for a while. That night, Caleb sat beside him on the cabin floor. He didn't open Walter's maps, didn't look at the assay reports, didn't care what the mountain contained. He watched Milo breathe. The dog had saved him twice now, once underground, once on the slope, and both times Milo had paid for Caleb's mistakes. Near midnight, Caleb stood and took Keller's purchase agreement from the drawer. $275,000. He placed it on the table. For years, Caleb had told himself, surviving meant knowing when to keep moving. Maybe Walter hadn't understood that. Maybe his father hadn't either. Maybe dead men could afford principles because they weren't around to pay for them. Caleb looked at Milo's stitched flank. I'm done. The shepherd slept. I mean it. In the morning, Caleb packed the truck. Walter's journals went into a box. His father's photograph went into the canvas bag. The purchase agreement sat on the passenger seat. He helped Milo outside. Easy. The shepherd climbed into the truck with difficulty. Caleb closed the door and walked around to the driver's side. He started the engine. For several seconds, he simply sat there. Then he reached for the gear shift. A sound came from the passenger side. The door was open. Caleb turned. Milo? The shepherd had climbed back out. Milo! The dog stood on the ground, favoring his left side. Then he began limping toward the woods behind the cabin. Caleb jumped from the truck. Hey, stop. Milo continued. Not toward the cave, not toward the mine, toward the old stone foundation where the survey ribbons disappeared into the trees. Milo, come. The shepherd stopped, looked back, then took another painful step into the brush. Caleb stared after him. The crossed-out red root was in that direction. Milo. The dog kept going. Caleb shut off the truck and followed. Milo, slow down. The shepherd ignored him, not completely. Every few yards he stopped, looked back, and waited until Caleb caught up. Then he continued through the wet brush with that stubborn, uneven gait. Caleb felt irritation rise in him because irritation was easier than fear. You've got stitches. Milo stopped beside the remains of the stone foundation. He lowered his nose, sniffed, then scratched once at the earth. Milo, no. The dog gave a soft whine and looked at him. Caleb stopped. There was something different about the ground. Yesterday he'd seen only moss-covered stones and brush. Now, standing directly over them, he noticed that the rocks formed a line. Not random. Stacked. Hand-laid. He crouched. All right. You win. Milo sat. Caleb pulled aside several dead branches. Beneath them, 2 shallow depressions ran parallel through the forest. He stood and followed them with his eyes. They continued downhill. Wheel ruts. Very old ones. Caleb's irritation vanished. He took Walter's map from his jacket and unfolded it against a tree. The red route. He checked the compass. Same direction. No. He looked at the ground again. The depression was too wide for a foot trail and too consistent to be drainage. Caleb walked another 20 yards. Milo followed until Caleb pointed firmly toward the foundation. Stay. For once, the dog listened. Caleb continued alone. Brush covered nearly everything, but the farther he went, the more evidence appeared. A cut through the hillside, a drainage ditch, then a retaining wall. 5 courses of stone held the outside edge of the slope, buried beneath decades of needles and moss. This had been a road. Not recently. Not for a very long time. Caleb returned to Milo. The shepherd was exactly where he'd left him. Caleb knelt beside him. What did you find? Milo leaned against his knee. Caleb looked toward the truck. The Keller agreement waited inside. An hour earlier, he had been leaving. Now he carried Milo back to the cabin. The dog had made his point. Caleb called Eleanor first. I need every historical plat you can find around Walter's property. Good morning to you too. I found a road. What road? I don't know yet. Then how do you know it's a road? Retaining wall. Parallel wheel depressions. Cut slope. Old drainage. A pause. Where? Behind the cabin. It follows one of Walter's markings. The red route? Yes, Eleanor's voice changed. Don't disturb anything else. I haven't. I'll call you. Next came Ben. He arrived 40 minutes later. The old miner stood beside the stone wall and stared downhill. I'll be damned. You've seen it? No. But you know what it is. Ben kicked gently at the edge of one rut. I know what it looks like. They followed the route only where the ground was safe, leaving Milo at the cabin to rest. The road descended in long switchbacks instead of taking the steep line Caleb had followed the day before. That explained Walter's red mark. Caleb hadn't been following the route itself. He'd been cutting across it. At one bend, they found an old iron pin set into stone. Farther down, a rotted post carried the remains of a square metal plate. No letters survived. Ben wiped moss from it. Mine Hall Road, maybe. To Dawson 3? Maybe. Caleb hated that word. By afternoon, Eleanor called back. Caleb, I found something. He put the phone on speaker. Ben leaned closer. There's an 1896 county plat showing a wagon road from the old Dawson workings down toward Silver Creek. Most later maps stopped depicting it after the mines closed. Where does it go? That's the interesting part. Caleb waited. It stays east of the boundary that became Keller's parcel. Ben looked at him. Caleb said nothing. Eleanor continued. And at the bottom, it appears to connect with an old county right-of-way. Appears? I need confirmation. Old maps are evidence, not magic. Roads can be abandoned, relocated, vacated, or lose practical usefulness, so we're not celebrating. Correct. Caleb looked at Walter's map. But if it was never legally vacated, then Keller may not control your only potential access. For the first time since Hannah had placed that boundary map on the table, Caleb felt the trap loosen. Not disappear. Loosen. Over the next several days, Eleanor worked through county archives while Caleb and Ben documented the visible road without clearing or altering it. Hannah compared its upper section to Walter's geological maps. The pieces began fitting together. The road had once served the old Dawson workings. Later, logging tracks and property divisions had replaced it. Trees grew across it. A landslide buried one switchback. People forgot. Paperwork didn't entirely forget. Eleanor finally drove to the cabin carrying a certified copy of an old county record. She placed it on Walter's table. The right-of-way was never formally vacated. Caleb read the page. Meaning? Meaning you have a credible argument for access that does not depend on Keller's permission. Credible. That's the word. You'll still need engineering work, permits, environmental review, and possibly a court determination before anyone drives heavy equipment over it. But Keller can't say he's the only way in. No. Eleanor smiled for the first time since arriving. He can't. Caleb looked toward Milo. The shepherd lay near the stove, stitches hidden beneath a clean dressing. Keller had offered money because he believed Caleb was cornered. Walter had known there was another route. But why cross it out? That evening, Caleb went through Walter's journals again. Page by page. Near the back of the final volume, 2 sheets had stuck together. Caleb carefully separated them. A pencil note appeared near the bottom. Men looking for gold stare into the mountain. The man who means to stay remembers the road home. Caleb read it aloud. Ben, sitting across the room, slowly smiled. That sounds like Walter. Caleb looked down at Milo. The dog had found the mine. He had warned them before the tunnel collapsed. He had stopped Caleb from sliding into the ravine. And now, injured and barely willing to put weight on one side, Milo had led him toward something none of the men studying the gold had bothered to see. The way out. Or maybe the way in. Caleb folded Keller's purchase agreement and placed it back in its envelope. He did not sign it. The next morning, sunlight reached the cabin after 3 days of cloud. Caleb was replacing a damaged board on the porch when his phone rang. He glanced at the screen. Grant Keller. Caleb let it ring once more, then answered, Keller. There was a pause on the other end. Mr. Dawson. The polished confidence was still there, but something beneath it had changed. I understand you've been reviewing some historical access records. Caleb looked toward the old road disappearing beneath the trees. Milo lay in the sun nearby. Sounds like you've been keeping busy too. I think it would be useful for us to talk. Caleb rested the hammer on the porch rail. Weeks ago, Keller's people had contacted the estate before Caleb even knew what Walter had left him. Then Keller had driven up the mountain with an offer and expected Caleb to make a decision. Now Keller was calling him. Caleb looked at Walter's compass hanging beside the cabin door. "All right," he said. "This time, you can listen." He did not sell the mountain, and the mountain did not make him rich overnight. The truth was slower than that. Eleanor spent months untangling deeds, access records, and Keller Ridge's competing claim. Hannah brought in independent specialists to review Walter's work and conduct additional surveys from safe ground. Every promising result seemed to create 3 new questions. There were permits, environmental studies, engineering reports, water management plans. Winter shut down half the fieldwork before anyone had answered whether Dawson No. 3 could ever become a commercially workable mine. But one thing had changed. Caleb was no longer negotiating from a corner. The forgotten road gave him a credible route independent of Keller's land, subject to the approvals and reconstruction it would need. Walter's records supported Caleb's mineral ownership more strongly than Keller's historical challenge supported theirs. Grant Keller came to the cabin one final time before the snow. This time, his SUV stopped below the porch. Caleb didn't go down to meet him. Keller walked up. Milo stood beside Caleb, the fur growing back over the thin scar on his flank. Keller noticed the dog. "He's looking better." "He is." Keller held out a folder. "We're prepared to revise our offer." Caleb didn't take it. "I'm not selling. You haven't heard the number." "Doesn't matter." Keller studied him. For a moment, the polished businessman disappeared, and Caleb saw only a tired man standing on a cold mountain. "You realize there may not be a mine here worth developing?" "I do. You could spend years finding that out." "I know. And if the economics don't work, you may end up with exactly what you started with." Caleb looked behind him at the cabin. New roof, repaired porch, smoke lifting from the chimney. "No," he said. "I won't." Keller followed his gaze. Something in his expression changed. Perhaps he finally understood. Caleb wasn't protecting the property because he knew there was a fortune beneath it. He was protecting it because it was his even if there wasn't. Keller put the folder back under his arm. "Good luck, Mr. Dawson." Caleb nodded. "You too." That was the last time Grant Keller came up the mountain. By spring, Keller Ridge's competing claim had failed to produce stronger evidence than Walter's records and Caleb's title history. The company withdrew its challenge rather than continue an expensive fight with uncertain odds. Caleb still didn't mind the ridge himself. Hannah had been clear about that from the beginning. Gold underground was not money in a bank. So Caleb, Eleanor, and Hannah negotiated with an established mining operator that had the engineers, equipment, insurance, and experience to investigate the deposit properly. The agreement took months. Caleb retained ownership of the land and mineral rights. Surface disturbance was restricted. Old growth sections and the creek were protected. Exploration had to follow environmental and safety requirements. If future drilling proved enough recoverable ore, Caleb would receive royalties. If it didn't, the mountain would remain his. The first legitimate payments were not millions. They didn't need to be. Caleb paid off the debts that had followed him from job to job. He repaired the truck instead of replacing it. Then he did something that surprised Eleanor. He spent part of the money rebuilding Walter's collapsed equipment shed. Ben watched the new roof go on. "You're opening a gold mine and building a repair shop. Gold doesn't need a hydraulic pump rebuilt. Ranchers do." Ben laughed. By summer, a hand-painted sign stood beside the road. Dawson Equipment Repair. The first customer brought an irrigation pump. The second brought a tractor starter. Then came a rancher with an old diesel generator Caleb was certain had been designed by a man who hated mechanics. Word traveled. Caleb worked with his hands. Milo slept beneath the workbench. People from Silver Creek stopped treating the Dawson place like an abandoned property at the end of a bad road. Ben came most Fridays with coffee. Hannah still appeared carrying rock samples and cautious sentences containing words like possible and preliminary. Eleanor visited after the final access documents were recorded. She stood on the porch looking toward the mountain. $22,000, she said. Caleb smiled. Sounded pretty good once. I remember. You told me the place had little conventional value. I was technically correct. You attorneys love that phrase. She laughed. Winter returned early. By December, snow covered the old road. The mine entrance had been secured behind a proper steel gate. No one entered the unstable sections without professional assessment, and the deeper exploration would wait for spring. One night, Caleb woke suddenly. Crack. His hand closed around the edge of the mattress. His eyes opened into darkness. For an instant, he wasn't home. His body searched before his mind understood. Door. Window. Distance. Exit. Then he heard breathing. Slow. Steady. Milo lay beside the bed. The shepherd raised his head. Caleb looked at him. I'm all right. Milo kept watching. Caleb sat up. The room returned piece by piece. The sound had been a log breaking in the stove. Nothing more. Walter's compass hung beside the door. His father's photograph stood on the mantel. Caleb stared at it for a moment. He still wished they'd had one more conversation. Some losses didn't become beautiful just because you understood them better. But the silence between them no longer meant what Caleb had believed it meant. His father had worried. His father had watched. His father had been proud. The truth hadn't returned the years. It had simply stopped those years from lying to him. Caleb pulled on his boots. Milo stood. You coming? The dog followed him outside. Snow fell without wind. The mountain was almost invisible beneath the night sky. Below the cabin, the forgotten road curved through the trees. Behind them, Dawson No. 3 waited beneath stone and timber. There might be enough gold there to change Caleb's life again. There might not. For once, he didn't need the answer tonight. Milo walked beside him, favoring his injured side slightly in the cold. Caleb noticed and shortened his stride. They reached the porch railing. Milo leaned his scarred shoulder gently against Caleb's leg. Caleb rested one hand between the shepherd's ears. From there, he could see the warm square of the cabin window. There had been a time when Caleb measured every place by its exits: motel rooms, job trailers, cheap apartments, even Walter's cabin when he'd first arrived. He'd always known how quickly he could leave. Now his truck sat outside without a packed duffel behind the seat. His tools had places on shelves. Food was in the cupboards. His father's photograph had a place on the mantel. Milo's blanket lay beside the stove. People had been right about one thing. The mountain had been abandoned. They had simply been wrong about what was buried there. The gold gave Caleb something valuable. Walter gave him the truth about his father. But Milo had done something neither money nor the dead could do. Every time Caleb was ready to walk away, the dog had found a reason for him to take one more step, toward the cave, toward the hidden records, toward the forgotten road, toward home. Caleb looked down. You knew before I did, didn't you? Milo pressed closer. Caleb smiled. The snow covered their tracks almost as quickly as they made them. Behind the ridge lay a forgotten gold mine. Below it lay a forgotten road. But Caleb watched neither. He watched the light in the cabin window. Then the mountain became completely silent. Years ago, silence had meant waiting for the next sound, the next order, the next reason to move. Caleb stood beside Milo and listened. nothing came. He didn't check the truck. He didn't study the road. He didn't look for an exit. He stayed. And maybe that's what home really is. Not the place where nothing hurts, but the place you finally choose not to run from. If Caleb and Milo's journey meant something to you, leave a simple one in the comments. If you believe a loyal dog can sometimes lead us where we need to be, leave a 0. And subscribe to the channel, because there are more stories waiting beyond the next mountain. Stories about second chances, unexpected courage, and the loyal companions who refuse to leave us behind. Until the next story, take care of yourself, take care of the ones who stay beside you, and remember, sometimes the road that looks forgotten is the one that finally leads you home.